We've become increasingly and distressingly prone to absolutist thinking, rigid and ultimately inert. This type of thinking cannot produce answers, find compromises, or say anything remotely profound. Instead, we get arguments that are reductionist and absurd. All opinions stem from this monotonous drone of media, a proof through repetition. Into this environment, I created a YouTube video called Because Fireball that attempted to show that we could not insist on applying logic to character rules and, by extension, non-character rules in Dungeons and Dragons. Mostly because in the latest iteration, they don't do the work to explain any premise for how magic forms. But I need to back up and define some terms before we can examine this position. Dungeons and Dragons is a fantasy game. Fantasy and reality are like oil and water. They don't actually mix. In fact, most definitions for the word fantasy will suggest that it's some kind of imaginary journey, a journey into something that is not real, impossible, or favorably to the genre, at the very least, non-probable. So this can create a contradiction that leads a nihilistic thinker to conclude that once you have any element of fantasy, you eliminate every element of reality. One drop of fantasy corrupts the whole cake. This is absurd on the face of it, and it's this far end of the spectrum thinking, and it's also demonstrably wrong, and I'll do that in a moment. I don't want to digress into epistemology, the branch of philosophy that studies how we know what we know. Suffice to say that we don't know the limits of our own reality. There's gaps in our understanding. We don't know what is true, so we have to use a slightly different yardstick. What is reasonable? Reasonable people work in the reasonable. These are called assumption or premises, and they are used so that we can reach this reasonable set of conclusions. This is what I referenced at the beginning. We do not have fantasy as some grand absolute. For whenever we engage our minds, we draw inferences, make comparisons, and use our imagination to fill in all the blanks of our understanding and comprehension. We're constructing a fantasy. We think in our imperfect, flawed understanding. Talking in absolutes is childish and simplistic. I can have some ideas with only my closest and most understood concepts, and some ideas that are vague or purposefully fanciful. So fantasy forms this continuum that runs the gamut from a peyote-induced fever dream to an historical interpretation of the fall of ancient Rome. They're both fantasy, but they're just on different parts of the scale. We cannot accept an interpretation that once we add one dose of fantasy into something, that we must be without logic. Fantasy, however contradictory it might seem, is required to make sense of reality. Now, I guess it wouldn't be 2020 if we didn't have some opposing pathology that was at once diametrically opposed, but intimately related to the original simplification. This is the school of blindly accepting everything. These positions are the same coin, just two different sides. Fantasy is flawed, therefore you can accept nothing, or fantasy is flawed, therefore you can accept everything. Now, this is often phrased in some version of willing suspension of disbelief. To engage in a fantasy novel, you must be willing to accept a certain amount of the unbelievable. Yes, but there are limits. The phrase willing suspension of disbelief comes from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who goes on to use a term less abused, poetic faith. It's often talked about in terms of theater and drama to explain dramatic conventions like asides and soliloquies. These are two dramatic rules by which a character might speak thoughts on stage, and the audience not only accepts these sounds as thoughts, but views them as private thoughts, existing in a secret personal bubble where time is suspended and reality is on a hiatus. Now here's the truth about asides and soliloquies. If you violate the rules, if you break the technique, you ruin the spell. A misplaced pronoun is sufficient to break the spell and confuse the audience. It's not the violation of the rule necessarily that breaks the spell, but it's the confusion that this creates. I'd like to put a pin in that, this whole concept of confusion. So, first, let's go back and look at Coleridge's quote in more detail. My endeavors should be directed to persons and characters supernatural, or at least romantic, yet so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagining that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitutes poetic faith. Did you catch that? A semblance of truth sufficient to procure. He's not talking about absolutes. He's talking about a sincere effort to confer a deeper truth. Art is allegory, and humans are symbologists looking for the similar in the dissimilar, holding contradiction as wisdom, looking for pattern, repetition, echoes, and reflection. Art is problem. Art is confusion. I told you we'd come back here. If you want to talk about it, you need to get yourself dirty and down in the mud with the incongruous little anomalies, those little bits of logic that almost fit, that do fit if you just bring into it the missing dimension, imagination. Imagination is pliable. It will stretch. But as Marion Zimmer Bradley says, it is also a suspension cable that can snap. Imagination is the fiber that connects the disconnected. Let me digress for a moment into etymology. Now, where do you think the magi in imagination comes from? Magos, the Greek word for the wise man learned in the mysteries. Imago, Latin for image. Magic, magi, image, imagination. Imagination is a wise reflection, not some idiotic, infantile, half-parts, poorly articulate mess of a word salad. Can you tell the difference? science. You can't get there with a rigid and dogmatic viewpoint, because either argument you make negates the whole enterprise. You have to work in the middle kingdom. You have to be moderate. We have two brains, in gross terms, a creative brain and a logical brain. Literally, there are two separate brain hemispheres, and the right side generally deals with creativity, and the left side generally logic. If you know a lot about this topic, please forgive my oversimplification. And for those who want to know more, read The Man Who Mistook His Wife as a Hat and Master and Servant. Excellent books. To be fully human, we must feed both sides. We must increase our capacity for logic and foster our creative play. Too long, as a society, we have accepted this excuse that it's not in my nature. I'm not a creative type, or I can't do math. You've been given custody of two children. Do not neglect one over the other. Nurture them both, and the whole will grow. Learn logic and science, and you will inoculate yourself against ancient alien theorists and Deepak Chopra alike, while fostering your imagination will allow you to draw inspiration from them all the same. It's in this middle ground where all the hard work is. This is the ability to differentiate from a small iota, a small crumb of poetic faith and the giant chasm of a fundamental flaw. So, to recap, there are two lazy ways to dismiss the argument that good fantasy should have a semblance of reality. The first way you do it is to assert that because fantasy is contrary to reality, it negates reality. I argued that you need imagination to make anything work because we are not omniscient. A speck of fantasy is required for any intellectual pursuit. Fantasy contaminates by degrees and by locality. The second, equally appalling viewpoint is that fantasy can freely and unreservedly coexist with logic. Nothing in this viewpoint strains the disbelief, as they are complete willing participants in whatever shenanigans unfold. And these two ideas amount to the same thing. Whether there is no logic or logic doesn't matter, we're going to hold our setting, we aren't going to hold our setting, to any kind of standard. So, what I said in the Because Fireball video is that magic requires a premise, a concept or worldview that gives it its spark. Something that is logical or sensible, something that follows from premise to conclusion. Magic doesn't need to be practically predictable, just logically predictable. Meaning that when the magical ingredients are present, we can get a set of magical results. We can have a sorcerer consuming willpower, risking a consequence to produce a magical effect. The premise is fantastical. The conclusion is logical. Putting constraints on magic, we leave room for logic. By embedding it into the world, we give it meaning and context. We strike a balance and ask people to accept a premise so that everyone is comfortable with the conclusions. And when this premise is steeped in the powerful mythologies, it resonates with an old familiar beat. I said earlier that you have to moderate and live in the middle kingdom. It is no accident that the middle world is a cross-cultural concept. Middle Kingdom China, Midgard, the Middle Ages, Middle-earth. Ancient Greek formalism and Ayurvedic systems can be profoundly similar in their treatment of the mind stuff. Formalism, saying that something is magical, is suggesting that a deeper spiritual and metaphoric truth can intrude on our purely logical world. Sometimes magic is as simple as a sad, sad man sitting in the sad, sad rain. It's about poetic faith. Now, I expect at this point that all the simpletons will have stopped this video, clicked the dislike button, and moved along to figure out the best way to configure the feats for their next tune. So, now that we're alone here, let's get back to the heart of my argument. Dungeons & Dragons is both a rule system and a setting. The player's handbook contains not just the mechanisms by which you resolve actions, but what types of people, races, populate our world, what special ability classes have, and what equipment they use. So it's more than just rules. So I'm going to talk about more than just rules. I'm going to talk about rules and content interchangeably, because they are just that. At the outset, we're asked to suspend our disbelief so that we can engage with the story. Okay? I just spent 10 minutes prattling on why this tolerance needs to exist and why this tolerance must be limited. Looking to the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, we're going to find a few interesting things. Pages and pages for trappings for the mundane world. Sections on explaining probability curves. Notes on the ecology of monsters, and not as in-depth as some of the Dragon Magazine articles, but still there. They have a recommended reading list for inspiration. Random dungeon generation. Notes on economies. These inclusions in the first edition's Dungeon Master's Guide weren't by accident. It spoke to a certain predilection in those who played the game. That the rule set was going to work hand in hand with logic. That we were going to evaluate both the rules and the reason. Now, my longtime friend Ian McDougall suggests that the DM, as the final arbiter, can inject sense into the system and just make it work. And he says, well, we should let the story drive the game. Here's the problem. The rules are the tools. If you abandon the rules and just goes with what seems right, you aren't really playing the game that we're talking about. You're still engaging in something worthwhile, but it isn't D&D. And when the Dungeon Master is asked to resolve something with fiat because it seems reasonable, it becomes unfair to the player to have lasting and meaningful consequence on a rule or a whim that you just make up. This is one of the reasons why you don't get interesting chases. DMs know where the drama is. The drama is when the players feel a sense of terror and wonder, a sense of adventure and a sense of consequence. Well, people preparing for a journey, characters preparing for a journey, don't feel that sense of danger because no GM in their right mind would think that it's fair to kill off a character that somebody's been playing for 5 years over a made up rule, over a rule that is barely a rule, over the fickle dice roll. The structures, the form of the game is designed so that in combat people clearly understand the consequences, and the dice shake out, and it creates a type of tension because you know that there is consequence, and it's in a fair and free environment, devoid of any tomfoolery. But the other parts of the game, the less well done parts of the game, well, that's where things start to suffer. So, in conclusion, I'd like to thank everyone for watching the video on Because Fireball. I hope this gives you some more context. Thanks so much, Ian McDougall, for engaging and actually talking about the video. I really appreciate that. And yeah, we got to get together and actually play some D&D sometime, or maybe we'll even play a different system. Anyhow, thanks so much, and hope you got something out of this. Take care.